This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, welcome everybody to what is now a recently invented tradition of the JSAS annual lecture. For those who don't know, JSAS is the Journal of Southern African Studies, and I'm the current chair, and my colleague Keith Shear has been organising these annual lectures since its inception. We've tried different formats. Last year, for example, it was at the biennial conference of the African Studies Association of the UK, but this year again we're back here as a standalone event. It is one of the highlights of the JSAS calendar and an opportunity to bring together a diverse audience in London or wherever the ASA UK conference is. Last year it was down at University of Sussex, and to celebrate some of the leading work from leading figures in Southern African studies. And we've also, as part of that tradition, published the papers subsequently in the journal where they're available for publication, because occasionally they are already committed elsewhere. I should say that after tonight's lecture, there will be refreshments outside just down the hallway, so please do join us for those. And I would like to hand over now to Keith Shear to introduce tonight's speaker, Debbie Posel.
Well, thank you, David. It's very nice to welcome everyone here for the fourth annual JSAS lecture. Tonight, I'm very honored to introduce Professor Deborah Posel to you. Deborah is a professor of sociology at the University of Cape Town, heading the Institute for Humanities in Africa. Before that, she was the director of the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand. Debbie is, although a professor of sociology, also an outstanding historian, historical sociologist, and is perhaps particularly well known for her studies of apartheid, the making of apartheid in particular, and the hallmark of which I think was that it introduced a new phase in the historiography of apartheid, where we stopped looking at the coherences of the apartheid regime and how everything seemed to work, and she began to look at some of the vulnerabilities of apartheid, not just because she was doing this research in a period when the system was under challenge in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but also with an eye to the contradictions both in the ideology and in the capacity to implement a particularly rigorous system of racial segregation and social engineering in South Africa in the post-1948 period. And I think this kind of counterintuitive reasoning and close attention to the contradictions of social and historical processes is a hallmark of Deborah's work. I think what always stands out in everything I've ever read by her is the lucidity and the clarity of Deborah's reasoning that she brings to absolutely everything, and which is not always the hallmark of South African intellectuals, shall we say, but in this case is very much to the fore. Whether it's bringing clarity to the race-class debate, whether it is analyzing the issues of apartheid, and of course not just the ideologies of apartheid, but wonderful investigations of both the irrationalities and the rationalities of apartheid, shall we say. And of course she has gone on to do much other work on sexuality and discourses about sexuality, rape, violence, and so on in post-apartheid South Africa. She's done work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I even understand she's been doing some family history. So Deborah is very wide-ranging intellectual and really an outstanding person to invite to a lecture like this. She's published often in the Journal of Southern African Studies, and we are delighted to welcome her back this evening. And the title of her talk is Strategic Recognition, Commerce, Consumerism, and the Pragmatics of Race in 20th Century South Africa. Deborah. Yes,
please. Thank you, Keith, for the exceedingly generous introduction, and to David. And to all of you, thank you for being here. I am deeply honored to have been invited to give this lecture, and it's wonderful to see so many friendly faces from my past. Hello. And to some new faces, people who I hope to meet afterwards. Keith mentioned that I'd been doing some family history, and I suppose I have to tell you that it was not long ago that I discovered that Keith is actually my cousin. For those of you who know the Yiddish word faribel, is that something that you know? Yeah, there was a faribel in the family which made that knowledge rather late in coming. Anyway, such are the ways. Okay. When I was invited to give this lecture several months ago, I think I was a little bit, or a lot ambitious in volunteering a title of such great expanse. So I'm going to have to shrink it a little bit for the purpose of 50 minutes worth of lectures. And so let's just stick with commerce, consumerism, and the pragmatics of race in apartheid South Africa. I shall forego the temptation to span the century in its entirety. And the strategic recognition part also I'm going to have to park. It was a concept that I had hoped to introduce, and it'll become perfectly obvious in the lecture the point at which I would have inserted it. But in order not to drone on and on and on, I have had to delete it, at least for the purposes of the lecture itself. Okay. So let me start with a series of propositions that I imagine are entirely uncontroversial. I suspect that those of us familiar with South Africa's history will agree that its racial order had powerfully material underpinnings. Indeed, that any racial order has had powerfully material underpinnings. By now, it's probably completely incontrovertible that the racial edifices of segregationism and then apartheid were built on regimes of production that extracted black people's labor at politically inhibited prices, relying upon an elaborate legal and bureaucratic apparatus developed largely for that purpose. It has been widely accepted that one of the primary drivers of segregationism and apartheid was the pursuit of white prosperity, and that cheap black labor was an essential engine thereof. Less familiar, perhaps more controversial, is the proposition that has underpinned my research in recent years, which is that if we want to understand the material underpinnings of the racial order, then we also have to take the sphere of consumption into account, alongside and interrelated with that of production. The making of race, in my view, has been closely bound up with the regulation of material consumption. And arguably, white prosperity was fueled by black people's consumption alongside and intertwined with white access to cheap black labor. In the first instance, this was a direct consequence of the demography of the country, the abiding fact of an overwhelming black majority, without whose custom it would have been impossible to sustain a viable market for locally manufactured or for imported goods. It's a very simple point, a demographic no-brainer, in fact. But its implications have received surprisingly little attention in the study of apartheid, not least in relation to the regulation of race. And I have to say that includes me. Having been a scholar of apartheid for decades, I too was largely indifferent to the question of consumption. So this then is where I want to start. my lecture with the sphere of consumption, material consumption. More specifically, because I obviously can't deal with all of that, more specifically, I want to deal with the pursuit by white commerce of the black consumer as an idea as much as a reality. I do so not merely because this is a facet of South Africa's history that has been little researched, but also to consider how this analytical turn to the sphere of consumption might shift the ways we understand the nature of apartheid and the kind of society that it produced. Let me just say, in terms of the question of nomenclature, I'm going to use the term black, largely in the apartheid sense thereof, referring to people who were either designated as native or Bantu or African, most of the time. That's the sense in which I'm using it. I'm going to confine myself to the first 2 decades post-World War II, so the 1950s and the 60s, and I do so for particular reasons. In much of the capitalist world, this was a time of what has been called mass consumerism, a term that I use with some caution. I agree with the historian of consumption, Frank Trinkman, that the phenomenon is always historically particular and globally uneven as a consequence. Yet mass consumerism is also a repertoire of worldliness, born of transnational linkages and global flows of images and things, which have produced connections and similarities. So all forms of mass consumerism are marked by some commonalities, notably the existence of transnational mass markets straddling class lines, along with mass aspirations and desires to consume an unlimited variety and number of things. So as a regulatory regime, which I think it is, mass consumerism manifests a material and an ideological investment in consumerism for all, as opposed to for selected elites, albeit under undoubtedly unequal conditions. As Rosalind Williams puts it, and I'm quoting, "The merchandise itself is by no means available to all, but the vision of a seemingly unlimited profusion of commodities is available across the board." In some parts of the world, including the USA, the UK, and parts of Europe, the origins of mass consumerism predate World War II. But historians agree that the phenomenon is most clearly recognizable in the 1950s and 1960s, during what Avner Offer and others have referred to as the golden age of capitalism, a period of sustained economic growth, low unemployment, rising disposable incomes, with new technologies of and investments in mass production, leading to an ever bigger consumerist cornucopia that purported to offer the stuff of domestic bliss and aspirations to national prosperity. In South Africa, too, the post-war period ushered in 2 decades of unprecedented prosperity, more especially the 1960s. More and more stuff was in circulation here, too. Some of it imported, some of it locally manufactured. The journeys and destinations of such things shaped by a national history as well as its transnational connections. But significantly, at least as I see it, mass consumerism in South Africa came of age in exactly the decade in which apartheid reached its zenith. Okay, let's call it the grand apartheid of the 1960s. Manifest in a more rigidly exclusionary racial order, more authoritarian and aggressive social engineering, and ideologically a newly emphatic insistence on the ineradicable differences between people of different races. So, in focusing on the first 2 decades post-World War II, I'm interested in how these 2 trajectories intersected, particularly during the 1960s. The articulation between mass consumerism in the particular form which took root in South Africa and grand apartheid. The argument I want to make in this paper is a thin slice of a larger argument which has emerged during the course of a bigger research project over recent years. So what I'd like to begin by doing is situate this paper very briefly in relation to the wider remit of the research and the genealogy, the ways in which my findings have evolved during the course thereof. My first foray into this area was published in a paper published in 2010, which I called Races to Consume, which provided the foundation for the subsequent research. In that paper, I suggested that the making of the racial order in South Africa, particularly in 20th century South Africa, was in part a way of regulating people's aspirations, interests, and powers as consumers. The desire and power to consume was racialized at the same time as it was fundamental in the very making of race. In an increasingly rigid racial hierarchy, people classified as native or Bantu were thereby deemed to be less deserving of the economic opportunities and prospects for upward mobility and social sophistication that informed the categorization of whiteness. And in being defined as less worthy, black people were treated accordingly, circularly confirming the presumption that race was a judgment of inferior accomplishment and social standing. Hence the familiar strategies of African township underdevelopment, intended to produce spaces of a particular kind of sparseness in everyday life. Apart from small local shops selling basic groceries, shopping facilities in townships were expressly prohibited. Statutory restrictions were imposed on African earning and purchasing power, with wages racially pegged, and job reservation measures intended to bar black people from higher paying and more skilled work. You're all very familiar with that. That consumerist notions of the good life emerged within the black population, which they did, I depicted in that paper as emerging from the bottom up, as an expression of the aspirations and desires to consume that flourished assertively in spite of the apartheid order of things. I've subsequently realized that this argument is incomplete. I don't think it's wrong, I just think it's incomplete, capturing only one side of the story. To my surprise, my more recent research has revealed the extent to which a consumerist project also emanated from the top down, as part of the apartheid order of things. I now want to argue that the workings of apartheid actively enlisted white and black South Africans into an historically specific form of mass consumerism, shaped by the logics of race. This enlistment was not uniform, it was not monolithic, it was not consistent. Nevertheless, if apartheid South Africa did become a mass consumer society across racial lines, which I think it did, this was not merely an unintended consequence of a regime set on systematically excluding black people from the temptations of stuff. Apartheid also produced a simultaneous and deliberate enterprise of consumerist seduction directed towards the population at large. In respect of black people, this was seduction of a particular type, with apologies to Harold Walkley. A mix of temptation and denial, the legacies of which have surely made their mark in the transition to the new South Africa. Okay, so that's, in brief, the kind of argument that I want to make in the course of the lecture, but just two caveats very quickly before I begin. Firstly, I'm very, very conscious in the space of this lecture of having to use extremely broad brushstrokes for much of the talk. Almost every step in this argument would merit further substantiation and exploration, so feel free in question time. Also, there are a number of theoretical premises embedded in this talk, especially in relation to the ways I understand the state, the practice of race. I'm not going to don't have time to spell them out. I have done so in prior publications, but again, happy to talk about it. Okay, the critical centrality of black consumption for the accomplishment of white prosperity was the subject of discussion and debate in economic and political circles for many decades before World War II. In some instances, as early as the late 19th century, with the discovery of gold and diamonds. Indeed, some of the country's early entrepreneurs understood quite clearly how the racial demography of the country made white economic success dependent on both black labor and black consumption as opposite sides of the same coin. For example, John Garlick, who set up one of the most lucrative chains of department stores in the country from the late 1880s, recognized at the outset of his business enterprise that this doubling would be the paradoxical crucible of his commercial success. He saw that it would depend very heavily on the country's lowliest consumers, whose expenditure was meager in the singular, yet offered very rich pickings in the aggregate. As Garlick began to accumulate his personal fortune, which included the fruits of his trade on the newly discovered gold fields, he wrote in 1890, and I quote, "I have not the slightest doubt that the Kaffir trade," and apologies for the terminology of the time, "I have not the slightest doubt that the Kaffir trade will, as long as the gold lasts, be the trade upon which we can place most reliance. As long as the gold mines are worked, the Kaffirs can buy," unquote. Garlick was probably unusual for the clarity and prescience of that declaration. It would take some time for a concerted collective voice along these lines to emerge, at least within the white commercial sector. But by the 1950s, it was becoming loud and clear. Organized gatherings of white business were regularly regaled with purported measures of black purchasing power and the extent to which the continued profitability of commerce and industry alike would depend profoundly on nurturing and growing that power. As the Bantu Wage and Productivity Association put it in 1957, the native is the key to a bigger consumer market. Many complex fiscal and other problems loom ahead, essentially because our effective market is too small. The native market seems to be the only means by which economic prosperity can be increased in this country to substantially greater heights. By the 1960s, the growing preoccupation with black consumption, how to garner it, how to accelerate it, was intertwined with other economic trends. Buoyant economic growth, rising wages, albeit, of course, at a lesser rate than among black workers than whites. Some growth, to some extent inhibited, but nevertheless evident growth in semi-skilled and professional strata within the black population, all of which made for rising disposable incomes, in tandem with the proliferation of consumer demand for a wide variety of material goods. Although it should be said that the relationship between income and consumption was not straightforward, a fact confirmed with some anxiety by those agencies that kept a relatively close watch on the economic conditions of black life. The South African Institute of Race Relations, for example, whose researchers were sometimes incredulous at the extent to which apparently precarious households sustained the purchase of substantial items of furniture and clothing. These trends did not escape attention within the apartheid state. For example, one C.W. Prinsloo, who was Chief Information Officer of the Department of Bantu Administration and Development, gave a press interview in 1959 heralding a landscape of unprecedented opportunity. He said, "Rising incomes and standards of living are causing a social revolution among South Africa's Bantu. A new middle class is emerging, in some cases comparable to those in Western countries. The spending power of the Union's Bantu population is now substantially greater than £6 million a day," which I think was a completely fantastical figure, but I think gives some indication of the kind of point he was trying to make. And international attention to exactly these possibilities was also increasing. In 1960, J. Walter Thompson, which was the largest advertising agency in the world, undertook a special study of the South African market and underlined the fact that, I'm quoting, 11.5 million South Africans of non-white descent are experiencing a revolution of rising expectations. To some extent, the fruits of black consumption simply fell into the lap of white business, which largely monopolized the trade in commodities beyond the very basics, given a myriad restrictions imposed by the apartheid state on the advance of black business. But from the 1950s, increasing amounts of thought and energy would go into actively cultivating the tree in a bid to grow bigger and better fruit. Indeed, the black consumer became the subject of strategic debate and concerted intervention during these decades in what can be seen as a loosely coherent regulatory project, to which many sectors of white business and their representative associations, advertisers and market researchers, who were mostly but not entirely white, the white-owned media, and various state actors were party, albeit in often uneven and sometimes contradictory ways. This project took shape, not accidentally, in tandem with significant changes in the nature of advertising and marketing in South Africa, as well as more globally. Indeed, these constituencies played a critical role in framing and orchestrating the emerging discourse about the character and critical significance of black consumption. Large international advertising agencies had been quick to set up in South Africa. JWT, J. Walter Thompson, arrived in 1928. Grant Advertising, another American giant, in the 1930s. But in the main, for the first half of the century, South Africa's advertising sector remained unsophisticated and small scale. A document produced by JWT in 1944, pondering the agency's future in the country, noted the backwardness of advertising in South Africa at this time. A lot changed after the war. Amidst the boost to the scale, sophistication, and impact of advertising more widely in the West. This was partly a consequence of the changing character of manufacturing. With new technologies of mass production and rising disposable incomes in the midst of the post-war boom, there was a rather astounding proliferation of new kinds of commodities pitched to the expanding and materially lustful mass markets. For example, according to Waldo Langschmidt, who was one of South Africa's early market researchers, speaking in 1960, he said the president of Procter & Gamble was a large multinational that produced detergents, soaps, and stuff. The president of Procter & Gamble, he said, recently stated, that 70% of their turnover in 1959, 70%, came from products which were not in existence before World War II. In tandem with this, advertising and market research, now regarded as specialist disciplines and fields of expertise, grew more assertive and profitable, with business people willing to pay more for the services of advertisers and marketers, more persuaded of their likelihood of making a profitable difference to the volume of sales. In South Africa, the advertising sector became more effectively organized and somewhat more professionalized from the early 50s, albeit in the midst of recurring criticisms in some quarters of its relative immaturity. So a National Society of Advertisers was formed in 1952 with 106 advertisers as members. In 1956, a National Advertising Council was formed, and in 1958, it organized the first National Annual Advertising Convention. Alongside these developments, what was for South Africa a completely new profession of market research took root in the late 1940s, with eyes to a series of newly fertile markets on the horizon. White Afrikaners, women and children generally, as well as the country's black population. In respect of the latter, the marketing challenges were obvious. As an editorial in the advertising trade journal, Selling Age, put it, the Union's 12 million Africans formed the biggest market, actual and potential, for a very large number of consumer products manufactured by secondary industry. As such, they are the natural target for the efforts and the ingenuity of those concerned with swinging their tastes, desires, and habits one way or another. Bantu Press Pty Limited was an early pioneer in directing research and promoting advertising towards black consumers. In 1948, it launched with a boldly challenging statement of the problem to be tackled. The rhetoric was dramatic and unfamiliar, with a headline posing the question in big bold capital letters, who, question mark. It read like this. When the day dawns, who delivers your morning paper and milk? Who makes that pleasant morning cup of 5 roses tea? Who opens the carton of Post Toasties and prepares Bonnie Boy, Tiger, or Quaker Oats for the children going to school? Who? Then a long list of similar questions follows, gesturing towards the proximate yet mysterious presence of black people in white people's daily lives. And then I continue. People we see as vaguely as if they were shadows. Black people. 5/7 of our population, about whom we know so little, yet who know so much about us. Our daily needs, our likes and dislikes, our preferences for this or for that. People who are learning the use of everything we buy and sell. People who are yearning for an ever-widening range of the commodities which we produce. People who are earning more and more each year. It was an astute insight into a rather spectacular irony of apartheid's racial order, in barricading the territory into which advertisers aspired to adventure, by producing a systematic ignorance on the part of white people of the everyday lives and loves, habits and desires of the black people in their midst, reinforced, no doubt, by habits of black reserve and retreat behind the masks of civility. For the market researchers then, the challenge was to make the strange more familiar, to find ways of luring black people out of the shadows into a new kind of scrutiny as the condition of securing their custom. It suggested the need for strategies of getting to know potential black customers, an aspiration to new kinds of information and representation predicated on unfamiliarly proximate sorts of interactions and relationships. The necessity of getting to know the black consumer had become a concern within the state too, notably within the Department of Bantu Administration and Development. If C.W. Prinsloo was alert to the need to channel the spectacular purchasing power of a new middle class in the right ways, the minister, Don de Vetnel, spelt out the discursive terrain upon which he thought such channeling should depend. Speaking at the first National Advertising Convention in 1958, he urged the assembled gathering to, quote, tackle the Bantu market energetically and carefully. As a European and a cabinet minister, he said, I am fully aware of my grave responsibility to the Bantu. You, no doubt, are just as deeply conscious of your own responsibility as Europeans and as a society of advertisers, which will play an increasingly important role in the development of the Bantu market, yes, but also of the Bantu mind. He likened the advertisers to missionaries, and I'm quoting again, what the missionary is to religion, the advertiser is to the economic life of the country. Here a great task awaits you, he said. You will have to educate the Bantu. It will be education in the true sense of the word. Here you will have to fulfill the role of the missionary who is the bearer of a message. What he envisaged was an exercise in getting to know the ineradicable otherness of the Bantu mind, so that advertisers could take heed of the discomforts of material westernization. As Iselin had put it, the Secretary of Native Affairs, Iselin had put it some years before, Africans in townships, he said, were not at home in the Western culture they have adopted. Rather, authentically African consumption, with genuine cultural roots, would be ethnically constituted. So de Vetnel, in addressing the convention, insisted that, quote, anyone who claims that his methods of advertising for the Zulus will always be equally successful with the Sutus is simply displaying his ignorance. Within organized business circles, however, most recognized what one prominent advertiser called the air of unreality in this line of thinking. For the large majority of advertisers and market researchers, the unit of analysis would be racial, not ethnic, with some recognition of the mediating effects of class differences in constituting reasonably distinct market segments. Their new knowledge project devolved to a considerable extent on the familiar repertoires of market research, surveys, and interviews. In 1957, Grant Advertising was the first to establish its own Bantu research unit, mandated to tour the country and find out more about product usage and media penetration within various types of black residential areas. Several other agencies followed suit. But especially at the top end of the sector, increasing reliance was placed on the appointment of what became known as black gurus. Key informants, who were men in the main, certainly in the beginning they were all men, who were presumed to know already the kinds of things that black consumers wanted to buy. In 1958, JWT employed Nimrod Mkele, who was the country's first black industrial psychologist, as their first black marketing consultant. In 1960, Bantu Press hired one Daniel Chocho to advise advertising agencies in Cape Town on their black market, following a so-called study tour in the United States, funded by the US State Department. And therein lies a very interesting and interwoven tale about the politics of the Cold War, which is actually ultimately a very interesting strand of discussion in all of this, which I can't go into in the paper. Also in 1960, Coca-Cola hired its first black guru, qualified social worker and well-known man about town, Knox Kalawati. Originally a very small handful, the numbers of black gurus grew somewhat during the course of the 1960s and beyond, such that most big and influential advertising agencies and several of the large retailers would have hired at least one. Veteran advertising executive Bob Rightford explained the thinking behind this practice to me. He, that is the black guru, he said, he knew his people. He had a mother, a sister, a wife. We took him to client presentations. He was the guru. They would take his view. He would also comment on advertising copy, especially on the details. And I love this bit. He was always well-dressed, not out of place in any white organization. Nimrod Mkele fitted the bill extremely well. Urbane, well-educated, intelligent, and articulate, and impeccably turned out. He was an influential invited speaker at several business meetings, including the annual advertising conventions. The message he gave repeatedly was one that squared in key ways with what other surveys and information gathering exercises were producing, at least in the in the kinds of fora that I've been talking about. So in a long address to the second advertising convention in 1959, he presented the black consumer as discerning, increasingly sophisticated, especially those among the middle class, the new middle class, with an unmistakable preference for Western goods, procured with a keen eye for quality. Black consumers, as depicted by Mkele, were willing to pay a price for quality, strongly associated with reputable brands. Mkele did point out that, quote, the process of identification with European standards was not complete. The advertising sector should not rest on its laurels, therefore, but that the direction of change towards increasing identification with European standards, he suggested, was cast in stone. A survey of the Transkei, conducted for the advertising journal Selling Age in 1963, concurred with Mkele's overall characterization, and across the board, beyond the enclave of the urban middle class. It found that the trend, I'm quoting, towards buying the European status goods is as noticeable throughout the region, that is the Transkei, as it is in the larger, more sophisticated cities. This trend will not be halted, and it is clear that the market will become more sophisticated as time passes. In the main, then, the emergent discourse produced about the black consumer in these circles showed him, and increasingly her, to be much like their white consumer counterparts, and increasingly so. the predilection for modern and stylish things, as presented here, did not observe racial boundaries. Instead, it suggested a point of racial convergence in prevailing tastes and desires, especially, but not exclusively, at the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum. In her recent doctoral research on advertising in the black market, Mary Robertson has pointed out that the place of race and racial difference in this rendition was ultimately ambiguous. Black consumers were like white consumers, but their blackness, and therefore their difference, was never effaced. I think she's absolutely right. But I would add to her analysis of the origins and significance of the ambiguity. Two sites of anxiety could unsettle the rhetoric of consumerist convergence. The first was a long-standing white distaste at the alleged racial mimicry performed by black people allegedly consuming beyond their proper racial station. Zina Magubani, for example, has recounted such reactions to the figure of the black swell on the gold and diamond fields of the late 19th, early 20th century, and echoed in other urban spaces and settings. As the prospects for a profitable black consumer market grew, so too did the abiding conundrum. In a society in which the very idea of race was explicitly a judgment of social standing, and if material possessions were markers of social standing, then marketing the material accoutrement of whiteness to black people on the assumption that this constituted the acme of black desire was bound to present something of a racial affront. The second anxiety was a more paternalistic concern on the part of whites disturbed by the tendency among economically vulnerable black people to spend apparently disproportionate amounts of money on unnecessary or luxury items, such as pianos or large items of furniture or expensive clothing. It was a case of economic irrationality and cultural maladjustment, to quote Reinhold Jones of the Institute of Race Relations. Each of these merits further commentary, but at this point, suffice it for me to suggest that as a consequence, from the late 19th century, social commentary on the consumption patterns of the country's different races often revealed an abiding normative opposition between white material abundance, which was a good thing, and black material excess, which was definitely not a good thing. It informed the persistence, indeed the intensification, of legal barriers to black affluence, limits on the standards of township housing, and restrictions on black people's leisure and lifestyle choices in the name of separate development that I alluded to earlier in the paper. Another marker of the traction of this normative binary in the 1950s and 60s is surely the terminology with which white people commonly referred to the top end of the black socioeconomic spectrum, always as a middle class, as if with nothing above it, tacitly suggesting a preferred and intact ceiling on black material aspirations and accomplishments. So no doubt the social prevalence of this binary constituted a counterpoint to the emerging market research orthodoxy about a fundamental sameness of consumer needs and desires across racial divides. But for the purposes of advertising and selling, the premise of consumer convergence remained the dominant one, certainly among the bigger and more influential ad agencies and market researchers, not least on pragmatic grounds, since this was, by definition, the more familiar territory to navigate, the easier territory to enter. Okay, I want now, just very briefly, to consider how this emergent discourse, this way of thinking and representing the black consumer, made itself felt in two sorts of racial practices directed at black consumers. First, I want to just look very briefly at some adverts, and secondly, at the space and activity of shopping. Okay, the advertisements. Okay, this discussion, alas, has to be scandalously scant. In the 1950s and 60s, advertising agencies of varying sizes and reach produced many different kinds of ads within very different kinds of budgets and with different kinds of expertise. And ads were crafted for and disseminated by a variety of media. The analysis I'm going to give here is confined to visual advertisements and largely within the consumer magazines that circulated widely within black urban townships and to some extent in more rural areas too. And I'm drawing in particular on two magazines, one of which you're probably very familiar with, the magazine Drum. You probably know it as a magazine well known for its political commentary and content, but as Les Switzer recognized a long time ago, it was also very much a consumer magazine, punting a version of the good life replete with all kinds of material stuff. The other magazine is a magazine less well known, probably called Zonk, which was unabashedly and merely a consumer magazine, punting a version of the good life in similar terms. These magazines, both white-owned, white-controlled, had reasonable circulation figures. Drum sold 65,000 copies a year by the late 50s. Zonk, much the same. But they were also magazines which had a very much wider reach. Each individual copy would be much more widely shared among indeterminate numbers of people. So I think they are significant as media. And especially in the case of Zonk, less so in the case of Drum because of other sources of revenue, but especially in the case of Zonk, advertising was a critical source of revenue. So the life of the magazine depended on securing lots and lots of adverts, many of which were full-page adverts, and several of them were in full color. Going through these adverts, I was actually really surprised. So I've got some of them here. I just want to show them to you. Okay, so apologies for the bad copy. I was not supposed to photograph them, so these are all illegal copies. So, okay, so just have a quick squiz at the images. That's Hubbly Bubbly. There's two Lux adverts. One Coca-Cola. Wool. That, by the way, is Nimrod and Pele, who also doubled as a model. There's another wool one. And this is my favorite one. Is that not a remarkable advert for 1960? This is an advert that appeared in Zonk magazine in 1960. Okay. So, let me just make a few remarks about what seemed to me interesting features about these adverts. The larger ad agencies in the country, the ones that had the bigger multinational corporate clients, had strong connections, unsurprisingly, to the United States and to Europe. In the main, they adopted the dominant paradigm that shaped advertising in these places during the 1950s and 60s, drawing on the genre of market research that became known as motivational research, championed by the likes of Ernest Dichter. In this paradigm, consumers were largely creatures of affect rather than reason, driven by unconscious desires and longings. The task of the advertiser would be to tap into those desires and longings by producing adverts that captured consumer aspirations rather than simply conveying product information in accordance with the realities of people's lives. I'm sure you can see in these adverts the influence of motivational research is very evident. They are all conceptualized and devised as aspirational adverts, pitched to an emergent middle class, but also to the throngs of aspirant consumers amongst the economically more modest majority. These were ads that depicted the good life, not necessarily as it was, surely not as it was, but as it was purportedly desired to become. But notice another interesting feature. All the photographic models in these adverts are black, which is interesting because this was happening in South Africa far earlier than it was happening in other parts of the world. So, for example, Ebony magazine, which is upon which Zonk actually was modeled, the big consumer magazine Ebony in the States, until the late 50s, the models in adverts pitched at black people were white models. Okay. In South Africa, not at all. Photographic models were black. And there are no whites in any of these scenes. Okay. What is being depicted here is black people living black lives. But they're black, and to that extent, very much within the apartheid imaginary of racial separateness. And yet, These representations of blackness are also fundamentally at odds with that apartheid imaginary. If the latter insisted implacably on a racial hierarchy of virtue and civilization, these are adverts that posit the possibility of something far more horizontal, actually, albeit within the world of commodities and on a shared landscape of class. These were black people in a black world, but whose consumer lifestyles, desires, interests, and pleasures were recognizably similar to those of white people. Here were black people depicted doing exactly the same kinds of things that white people would do, indeed as if they could be white. So the Lux adverts, for example, were exactly the same adverts that would have appeared in Fair Lady or Hespenot, although in that instance the model would be white. Similarly, in the Coca-Cola ad, all the models are black, but the advert itself effaces their race. There is nothing distinctively or recognizably black about the scene depicted, or about the people's relationships and interactions with Coca-Cola. And I think most astoundingly in this advert. Okay, a few brief remarks about shopping. Growing the fruits of black consumerism was aided, of course, by the pleasurability, or at least the inoffensiveness, of the experience of actually acquiring desirable commodities. Indeed, the space and experience of shopping for black consumers changed in significant ways in the post-war era, and in the 1960s in particular. The plethora of apartheid laws and regulations that restricted the growth of black retail trade in the townships meant that almost all such commodities had to be bought in white-owned shops located in designated white areas. Apartheid legislation, in other words, created and protected a white retail monopoly of the black market, the black consumer market. In the midst of all these myriad restrictions, there were some significant omissions, which also underline the enabling effects of state regulation on the cultivation of black consumerism. There were never any laws prohibiting black people from entering white shops in white areas. There were no laws restricting what white people could sell to black people, which is not insignificant if you consider the propensity on the part of the apartheid state to legislate and to regulate. How black shoppers were treated was at the discretion of the shop owner and the shop assistants. It's difficult to produce a comprehensive picture of what transpired, but it seems that on the eve of apartheid, and perhaps through much of the 1950s, it was common practice, maybe even the norm, to require black customers to use a separate entrance from the entrance that white customers used. And in the case of clothing stores, given the complicated micropolitics of racial intimacy in relation to clothing, black customers were generally not permitted to try things on before buying them, and they were not allowed to return them if they didn't fit. By the 1960s, in line with the overall reassessment of the importance of the black consumer market, many retailers were starting to rethink how to lure and retain the custom of black shoppers. Indeed, white retailers began to compete among themselves for their share of the black market. To draw black people into their shops typically required favorable options for credit, enabling black customers to purchase expensive items on lay-by. But it also depended on treating customers reasonably well. Word of mouth was powerful, after all. Unsurprisingly, in a society as racialized and racist as apartheid South Africa, this might have amounted to little more than a grudging civility on the part of disdainful shop assistants. As Noni Jabavu put it, even when they resent your custom, they seldom go so far as to repulse your money. But especially in the larger urban centers, many retailers went further, realizing the value in treating black customers more or less the same as white customers. In some cases, this occurred within the space of the same shop. For example, I have interviewed a man who worked as a salesman in ABC Shoes in downtown Johannesburg, which was the premier shoe shop at the time in the late 60s, which sold its most expensive imported lines of men's shoes to black customers whom they prided on treating especially well. Shoes were less intimate, perhaps, than clothing. So let me tell you about how some of the department stores went about dealing with the racial politics of the shop. And I'm going to choose the example of Edgar's, which those of you who come from South Africa will know, a very prominent chain of clothing stores. The first store opened in Johannesburg in 1929. By 1946, the company had done so well that it was listed on the JSE, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and by 1960 boasted 135 department stores across the country. In other words, doing very well. Before the 1960s, Edgar's did what most other clothing stores did. There were separate entrances for blacks and whites, and separate sections in the same store from which black and white customers could buy. Black people couldn't try on clothes before buying them, and they couldn't return them if they didn't like them or they didn't fit. Post-World War II, Sydney Press, who was the owner, made a very deliberate and concerted bid to grow the shop's black clientele, initially within the remit of this arrangement. In the late 50s and the early 1960s, Edgar's went to great lengths, sponsoring fashion shows and beauty competitions in the townships, with models wearing Edgar's clothing, which were also offered as prizes. They hired the popular and socially prominent musician Peter Rizant as an MC, which effectively drew the crowds as these became social occasions on which to be seen and photographed, photographs which were then posted in Zonk magazine. Perhaps because Sydney Press foresaw racial tensions within his stores as number of black customers increased, he then changed tack. In 1963, he created a department store specifically for black customers, with a look and feel very similar to Edgar's, located just around the corner in downtown Johannesburg. It was called Sales House. The idea was to create a shopping experience explicitly very similar to that of whites, beyond the indignity of separate sections and separate entrances, and abandoning the rules about trying on and returning goods. Once again, he went to great lengths to attract black customers. Sales House held regular store parties. Peter Rizant continued to MC fashion shows and beauty contests in the townships, showcasing Sales House gear. Sales House offered favorable terms of credit, 6 months to pay, and pitched to the top end of the market, moving some of the most expensive lines in imported men's clothing and shoes from Edgar's, in fact, to Sales House. This initiative and others like it worked, as evidenced by rising volumes of sales and profits. So much so that by the late 1960s, the Transvaal African Chamber of Commerce, which is an organization representing the very frustrated interests of black traders, expressed its anger at the growing allure of white department stores for black customers, the glamour of Elof Street, as they put it. It's the big department store that draws the African, I'm quoting, the bright lights and fantasy world of commerce that the African revels in. The world of commerce, in other words, from which black retailers were expressly excluded, and on the grounds of which they lobbied hard for the more effective racial segregation of retail trade, with absolutely no success. Enabled by that legal prohibition and the effective monopoly that resulted, as well as by the spaces opened up by apartheid regulations, retail shopping in white areas therefore reconfigured the regulation of race in ways that flouted the apartheid expectation. Certainly the reality of race was ever present, yet be it in a white shop intent on attracting a black clientele, or in a black shop making for an improved black shopping experience, the most lucrative shops were those that departed from an overtly racist treatment of black customers, substituting something more akin to the way the shopping experience was enjoyed by whites. Not out of love or affection, God forbid, but for pragmatic and strategic reasons. It was simply good for business. As was the case with the adverts that I showed you, the active pursuit of the increasingly sophisticated black consumer produced pragmatic repertoires of some human commonality, acknowledging and publicizing the possibility of a shared way of life, if only in the world of consumer goods. Its discourse produced a version of community, a community in things, a site of shared dignity even in the consumption of shared things. In short, it seems to me, a serious strategy of temptation, which produced a different repertoire of race as its instrument. All right, let me conclude. I set out to make a case for taking consumption seriously as an integral element in the making of the apartheid racial order. And in so doing, I suggested that this might be an interesting vantage point from which to reconsider the nature of that racial order and the kind of society it produced. So let me end off by summarizing what as I see it, comes into view that is not otherwise apparent. I started off with the proposition that black consumption was a condition of white prosperity. I haven't tried to quantify that dependence, but I hope to have gone some way towards establishing that this was certainly a powerful perception within government and white business circles. And with that, the driver of a series of interventions to woo black consumers, dependent on and enabled by the ways in which apartheid legislation was positioned. And more assiduously so as time wore on, particularly during the economic buoyancy of the 1960s. These strategies of consumerist contemptation were undertaken, no doubt, with varying degrees of interest, conviction, and success. Both the intentions and the effects were highly uneven, no doubt. And yet, I have argued they should be taken seriously as a formative aspect of the apartheid order that developed post-war, especially so in tandem with the ideological grandiosities and authoritarian hubris of grand apartheid. In essence, these efforts were invitations to black people to participate and find a place in a shared world of commodities. It remained a highly racialized world, always, and yet on very different terms from the ways in which race operated in most other spheres. It was a place in which a degree of respect, pragmatically, dignity even, was afforded. A place where interactions broke the molds of boskap. A place where black people asserted their agency, not as resistance, but in the form of choices that white traders had to respect, and in the form of expertise that white business people were willing to pay for. Most surprisingly, perhaps, this was not happening as the rigidities of grand apartheid began to give way in the 1970s, as an element of the economically pragmatic reformism of the last phase of apartheid. This was a consumerist seduction at the very heart of the grand apartheid